In this video, I want to take a look at a game that I played about a year ago. And, well, it's always interesting to look at games that you've played, several months or a year ago or a couple of years, because you can see the improvements that you've made. In this game, even though it was a rapid game, I could, just by looking at the game, see that there are a few instances where I just intuitively knew that the move that I played was not correct, and the move that I would play today if I had that position is actually the best move in the position. It's also interesting to see that after move 20, my opponent played the engine's top choice, but by then my position was completely winning, so it didn't really matter. So I had the white pieces, and we have a King's Gambit accepted. And here my opponent played a move which I don't see very often, Knight f6. There's a lot of other options that I see more frequently. And here I played Knight c3, defending the pawn. And my opponent played this move Bishop b4, which the idea is very simple. You just want to take the knight and then take the pawn, which I think is rather greedy considering black is already up a pawn. The best move, or the move that is played more frequently, is d5. This is by far the most common move in this position, and I also believe it is the strongest move. After this, I think white already has an advantage. So I play e5, and here, well, knight h5 does seem kind of strange putting the knight on the side of the board, but it is better than putting it back on its original square. And actually the knight is actually pretty well placed here to defend the pawn on f4. So here I wanted to play d4, but if I do that, then after bishop takes and pawn takes, my position is good, but it's not great. If I play knight d5, I'm hitting the bishop and I'm centralizing the knight, so I'm also gaining tempo, which is crucial in openings like the King's Gambit because it's very sharp. And after bishop c5, I think this is just a very bad move because you gain another tempo with d4. I think you had bishop e7 was the only move. And well, after bishop b6, I made a mistake. What you want to do as a King's Gambit player is to get your pawn back, which is what I did. But here, g4 is actually winning a piece. You could analyze it on your own if you want, but after something like d6 and takes, well, you're just up a piece. But well, I took the knight and I'm still better, so we traded knights and my opponent castled. And now this is kind of looking like a French defense if black ever gets to play d5 and c6. So I played bishop d3, and here my opponent played a really bad move, knight c6. And well, here I played the Demez move, which is the bishop sacrifice on h7. My opponent played king h8. It doesn't really matter if you take the bishop, you're still gonna lose. Now, interestingly, d6 actually is the best move, and you cannot sacrifice the bishop in this position. Now, why is that? Well, if you sacrifice the bishop after king takes, knight g5 check, came back, and queen h5, threatening checkmate, well, bishop f5 saves the game. But after knight c6, that resource with bishop f5 doesn't exist because the pawn is still blocking the bishop. So after takes, my opponent played king h8. Here I played c3, which is what I was saying earlier. It's not the correct idea. Knight g5 immediately is much stronger. And if you try to get greedy with black, say you take, well, after queen h5, you can't stop mate. Even if you sacrifice the queen, you still can't stop checkmate. So, but I decided to play c3 because, well, I didn't want my opponent getting counterplay. So maybe a little bit too cautious when you're playing the King's Gambit. You don't have that luxury of being playing these moves like c3. So after d6, knight g5, defending the bishop and opening up this diagonal for my queen. My opponent played g6, which means now I have to sacrifice a piece because the bishop is trapped. And here I played another move, which I just look at it and I go, no, this is too slow, this is not working. Now the idea is, if I have the chance, well, I'm going to play h5 and then take and open up this file for the rook, but it's just not fast enough. What I had to do was play something like knight f7 check. Now, this is very similar to a different variation, but I believe that white is actually winning in this particular line. So after rook takes, bishop takes, rook takes f4, queen check, and check again on h7. Well, after king f8, there's no mate, there's really no checks, except for queen h6 check, regaining the rook. But, well, it's a pretty long variation, so there's always the chance that you'll make a mistake. And here, after h4, my opponent played the best move, which is to take on e5. And it doesn't allow me to time to play h5. It also stops me from this check because, well, after knight takes, pawn takes, we trade queens, and I don't really have an attack. So here I was more or less forced to sacrifice the knight. Although the engine doesn't like it, I think from a practical point of view, I think it's the best choice. So rook takes and bishop takes, and here my opponent just played this really strange move, rook h7. I'm thinking maybe it was a mouse slip, although it was a rapid game, so I don't know. I mean, rook g7 maybe. What I thought my opponent would play was rook takes and f4, which seems like the most obvious move. And after queen check, well, you have the same position as before, except the pawn is defending the rook, so there is no queen check, and then you take the rook. And so because of that, black is actually better in this position. But after this, well, I just took the rook, not because I wanted the exchange, but because the queen is coming in with a check, and, well, this rook is not doing anything, you could take it off the board. So it's basically 2 rooks and a bishop against 3 minor pieces. So it's almost like I'm up 2 exchanges. After king g8, well, king g7 leads to the same thing. We check, and well, after this move, pretty much everything is winning. Castles is winning, rook f1 is winning, bishop h6 is winning. But I decided to play bishop g5. So I'm attacking the queen, I'm threatening castles or rook f1 check. The reason I didn't play bishop h6 check was because, well, after this king e7 and the king is gonna go depending on where I check, either to d7 or d6, and I just didn't want to allow my opponent that option. And while dealing with one threat is possible, but dealing with 2 of them, it's sometimes not really possible. So my opponent played knight e7, but now this allows mate in 1, which I missed. I guess I was running out of time, so I castled instead. Sometimes you get fixated on one idea, so you just get blinded by other possibilities. And I guess this was one of those instances. So here my opponent blocked the check, but it doesn't really do anything. I could still play bishop h6 mate. But here I took and played rook f1. I didn't even bother taking the queen, although that's also winning. And like I said, after move 20, my opponent played, I believe, all the correct or the engine stop recommendation. So takes, knight takes, rook f1, bishop takes d4 check. Here I played king h1. You could take the bishop apparently, and the queen check doesn't really do anything. But I didn't want to allow any chances, so I just played king h1. There is no knight g3 check because the knight is pinned. And here I took, again, my opponent played the engine stop choice. And here I should have taken with the queen. I took with a pawn, which isn't very good. And here again, king e7, the engine stop choice. Here I should have played queen f6 check and then just take the knight with the queen, I suppose. Instead I took with a rook, and again, rook h8. There is no king g1 because of the bishop, so I have to sacrifice my queen back. But I had calculated that I should be fine. So rook takes, pawn takes, and again the engine stop choice by my opponent. And well, if you look at the pawns, we have 4 against 5, so if I can count, I'm only up a pawn, but I'm also up on exchange. But if we trade rook for bishop, the king and pawn endgame is just winning for me, which is what I did. I took, and my opponent recaptured, and I just played h7, and you can't stop the pawn from promoting. And the game went on for another 10 moves or so, but the game is essentially over. So yeah, sometimes you get lucky, and well, that's why I like playing the King's Gambit, because you usually get really nice attacking possibilities, and well, just like in this game, the game is essentially over after 20 moves. So I hope that you liked the video. If you did, please hit the like button and share and subscribe. And I will see you next time.